Hello, and welcome to a Postdocs Journal, the show that takes you through my journey into and eventually out of academia as a postdoctoral research scientist. My name is Simit Patel. Hello, thank you very much for joining me. For those of you who are perhaps new to the show, a very warm welcome. And for those of you who may have listened before, thank you very much for coming back. If you don't already know, this podcast is based on my own personal journal. In each episode, I read out a journal entry from about 12 years ago, back when I was working in academia as a research scientist, as a postdoc. Then I reflect on it, I analyze it, I try to make sense of it, and share my thoughts with you today with the benefit of 12 years of hindsight. If you are a student or a postdoc, or you're just someone struggling a bit in academia, or if you're just someone who can relate to things like imposter syndrome, loneliness, and just dealing with mental health challenges in the workplace, I hope that by sharing my own personal experience with you, that helps you to feel a little bit less alone. In today's episode, we jump to the middle of October 2012, just a couple of weeks after last week's episode. This was my first autumn in Germany, and that's when I realized just how beautiful autumn is in Germany. The colors you get on the trees is just magical, especially if you just get a little bit of sun. Unfortunately, in this journal entry, it doesn't sound like I'm enjoying any of that, and my mood certainly does not reflect the scenery. In this entry, I write about how I thought I was being bullied a little in the workplace. This is a sensitive subject for me. I experienced quite a lot of bullying early on in my life, and I think those wounds were still with me back in 2012 and arguably are still with me today. So please have a listen to the reading, and I'll be back at the end to share some thoughts with you after 12 years of hindsight. Enjoy. October 2012. My boss is pushing my, or I suppose our, research in different directions. He wants to abandon the GBS/RAD-tag sequencing and do pool sequencing instead. I'm a little uneasy about it. I'm worried I'm being pushed down a path that isn't good. For example, when my PhD supervisor said doing a linkage mapping study with Sapia nemiralis and AFLP markers was a good idea. I just went along with it because my supervisor told me so. I was inexperienced and I didn't know any better. It turns out it was a flawed study design from the start. The wrong type of marker with the wrong type of species. And it was a mistake to go down that path. And I paid the price for it with a substandard PhD thesis. When my current boss gets a new idea, he tends to get carried away with it. And I'm worried he's doing that because he doesn't have a full grasp of the nitty-gritty details of implementing the new idea. The details become my problem. It's very hard to argue against him, partially because he has this knee-jerk reaction to counter any argument with another argument, and partly because I don't have the confidence or strength of character to argue with him. My worst nightmare is having our collaborator coming to visit, and me having to explain to them, actually, we're not doing GBS or RAD-tag sequencing anymore, and the collaborator asking me, why? I would have to say, we thought pool-seq would be better. I wouldn't feel right about saying that, because it's not true. My boss decided it would be better, and I'm too weak to counter the argument. I've basically been bullied into it, not through any fault of my boss, but through my own inability to stand up for myself and to argue. The other side of it is that I've put so much effort into getting the GBS stuff to work in the lab. In all honesty, I find the technique more interesting. To have all that work go to waste is a tough pill to swallow. This feels like a test of setting my emotions aside from the science. Rather than making decisions based on my emotions about a particular technique, I have to look at it more objectively. The truth is, we don't need individual genotype information, and it is cheaper to do the project by pooling. The truth is, I can't come up with a scientific argument against doing things this way. The only argument I have against it is based on my own fears and concerns, which are purely emotive, not scientific. I just worry that we don't know enough about how any of the pool-seek stuff works. We're going into it blind without any relevant experience. I don't want any nasty surprises, not like with my PhD. Should I just stay quiet and go along with it? I feel embarrassed to say that I'm doing it just because my boss told me to. Rushing in without thinking or planning properly, and without understanding every little detail, was the problem with my postdoc from the very beginning. That's why nothing was working in the lab from the start. No one tested the enzymes, no one designed the oligos properly. Everyone, including my boss, just rushed in totally blind, and I ended up making a complete mess of it. Okay, thanks for listening to that. As usual, I've written down some thoughts after reading that back and hearing that back. I think in general, this entry is really just about me struggling to come to terms with the change of direction in my research. Change isn't easy for a lot of people, and I think it's particularly hard for me. I think there are many layers to this, some of which I actually already tried to analyze in the journal entry itself. First, I'm going to discuss how past experiences can really influence how we perceive things today. And then I want to address the question of, was I actually being bullied? Before we get into the reflection, I want to ask you a quick question. Do you ever worry about your paper being rejected because the English isn't good enough? One thing I've always been good at is writing, but I know not everyone finds that easy. Perhaps English isn't your first language, or for some reason, the words you write just don't quite capture what you want to say. Good English can enhance your scientific credibility, increase the chance of your article being accepted, and speed up the peer review process. Whether you're a research scientist, a scientific writer, or part of a dynamic biotech company, I want to help you with my professional copy editing and proofreading services for scientific English. Enhancing the clarity and precision of writing has been an integral part of my professional life in academia and in the biotech industry for over a decade. If you need a native English speaker with a solid scientific background and a professional certification in proofreading to refine and polish your writing, I would love to help you. Please visit simitpatel.com, that's simitpatel.com for more information. Thank you, and now back to the show. Firstly, I think this journal entry is a nice example of how past experiences can really influence your perception of things in the present. This is a known phenomenon in psychology, and it's clear that negative memories seem to have more of an impact than positive ones. We've talked a little bit about negative bias before in a slightly different context, but the same principle applies in the context of past experiences as well. In general, this is thought to be evolutionarily adaptive to focus on the negative things. In my case, I had some bad memories of how my PhD played out. As I described in the journal entry, half of my PhD project was basically just a badly conceived research idea. It was completely unfeasible from the very beginning, and I only realized that half my PhD project was flawed when I was actually writing up the thesis at the very end in the last 6 months. And that was really the first time that I had the time to really go in depth and do that in-depth reading and research around the topic that I really needed to do. And I actually had a bit of crappy data at that point, so I was actually able to make those valid comparisons between my project and previous studies that were previously done. I remember now that my PhD supervisor actually, very early on in my PhD, he said that the research project idea that he put together, he just kind of cobbled it together just for the sake of getting the grant application. And he wasn't too sure about it. He actually wanted me to disagree with him and challenge the research idea in the first place, which ultimately I never really did. And at the time, I didn't realize what this meant. I should have realized that this meant that he didn't know what he was doing, and I needed to fact-check the feasibility of this project from the very start. This was a big red flag that I just totally didn't see at the time. In my defense, and to be fair, I think it's very hard to do that when you've just started your PhD. I was 21 years old, and I was expected to be the expert right away. It took me about 4 years of very hard work to get to that expert level where I was able to challenge the feasibility of the project and have that discussion. But expecting that from me from the very beginning, I think, was just asking too much. And of course, by that point where I did have the expertise to challenge the feasibility of the project, it was too late. It was the end of my PhD. The lesson for me in that scenario was that when your boss comes up with an idea, it's not necessarily going to be a good one, because bosses don't always know what they're talking about. Even in the journal entry, I said something like, bosses often don't understand the nitty-gritty detail of what actually needs to be done to get from the start of the project to the end of the project. And I've got to say, in all my experience since then, that still holds, and that holds outside academia as well. I think a lot of bosses don't really understand the nitty-gritty detail of the ideas they come up with, and that becomes their underlings' problems. And assuming that your boss does know what they're doing is a very dangerous strategy. Coming back to this journal entry, I can see how 27-year-old Simit was drawing those parallels between what was happening or what happened during my PhD and what was happening in my postdoc. But the two scenarios were slightly different. I think one interesting parallel between those two scenarios was the requirement for me to argue better. My PhD supervisor actually needed that from me. He literally told me that when I started. He needed me to argue and come in and be the expert to challenge the feasibility of the project. He needed me to be the expert and say, this is going to work, this is not going to work, this is why it's not going to work, this is what we need to do instead. And of course, I couldn't do that. I wasn't at the sort of expert level I needed to be at the very start of my PhD to have those arguments. In this journal entry and in other journal entries we've covered in previous episodes, I attributed my inability to argue to my personality. So it wasn't about my expertise anymore, it was about my personality. What I wrote in this journal entry and others, I decided that my inability to stand up for myself and to disagree with other people was a character flaw in me, and that's why I wasn't able to have those arguments. Today, I still think it is part of my personality. I don't like confrontation, I don't like arguing with people. But I do think it's very unkind of myself to call it a flaw. Me not wanting confrontation, not wanting to argue with people it's just a part of who I am. And sometimes that causes problems in my life, but there's very little value in punishing myself for that. That's just is what it is. And there might even be times where other people tell me that that's a fault in my character and that's them not being very kind to me. But the bottom line is that is a part of who I am, and I accept that about myself, and fuck everyone else who thinks differently. Over the past, say, 12 years or so, I think the way I've learnt to cope with this part of my personality is to just avoid scenarios where I have to argue and disagree with people. And on balance, I think not having too many conflicts with other people has probably benefited me more than it's held me back overall. So maybe my inability to argue, as I put it, is actually one of my superpowers, not one of my major character flaws. Another interesting parallel between what happened during my PhD and what was happening in my postdoc in this journal entry was that decisions were being made by people who perhaps don't really know what they're doing. As already discussed, my PhD supervisor didn't know anything about the type of study that I was supposed to be doing. In this journal entry, I wrote about going into a new research area totally blind without any relevant experience. Now, some of the problems I experienced in the lab, which we've talked about in previous episodes, were very much due to that. No one really tested anything, and I was just kind of given everything at the beginning of my postdoc saying, these are the things that we've worked out so far, so this is what you need to build on. I assumed that everything had been tested properly and everything given to me was correct, and then all the things that were going wrong were due to me doing it wrong. But it turns out a lot of the things that were given to me were not designed properly and not tested properly, and that's why it pissed away so much time trying to get everything to work. I did eventually get everything to kind of work, although it sort of ended up falling flat on its face in the end. But I definitely wasted a lot of time because I made that assumption of other people knowing what they were doing, me not knowing what I was doing. So ultimately, I was paranoid about the same thing that happened during my PhD happening again in my postdoc. Now, I want to be clear, I don't think my PhD supervisor and my postdoc boss were bad scientists at all for taking this approach. I suppose that's what research is. It's the blind leading the blind until something works. I think a big part of being a research scientist, because you do have to go into new things all the time. That's why it's research. It's stuff that no one's ever done before. And I wasn't really comfortable with that level of uncertainty. That's just another aspect of my personality that made me unsuitable for a research career, and that's fine. Now, I think the big thing that's different between my PhD experience and my postdoc experience here, in my PhD, my supervisor actually didn't have the expertise in that particular topic that I was working on. In my postdoc, we tried this one approach in the lab, and I talked about it already. It didn't work ultimately, and time was running out, so we had to change direction. It was a pragmatic move and the right one to make from my boss's point of view and from the point of view of the research. And with hindsight, I can tell you now that the change in direction for my research was actually absolutely the right choice to make. The original plan just wasn't working, and the new direction did end up working. And that actually put me on the path to some relative success, and I was actually able to develop the skills I needed in this new research direction, particularly in bioinformatics, which ultimately helped me in my career move out of academia. So it was absolutely the right move with hindsight. Another aspect of why I was having such a difficult time accepting the change in direction of my research was that I had invested so much time in getting things to work in the lab already, and I was finally making some progress. It was not good progress, but it was some progress. I don't have much to add to this point because I actually did most of the analysis in the journal entry itself. And ultimately, I was actually able to separate the emotions from the logic. Well done me. I think I did well in that journal entry to come to that realization. Now, in this journal entry, I said that I felt like I was being bullied. And a question that I have to ask myself now is, was it actually bullying? I think this might be another example of how past negative experiences can really affect your perception of things in the present day. In this case, I think there was an emotional trigger here that brought the past into the present for me. In general, when this kind of thing happens, the emotional response can sometimes be disproportionate to the actual situation in hand. In my case, I was bullied quite a lot when I was a kid, a little bit at school, but mostly by family. And this has very much stayed with me. Anyone who's ever been bullied before, I hope you understand the scars it can leave you with sometimes can take a long time to heal. Sometimes they never do. In my case, when I encountered that feeling of anxiety when faced with confrontation again, in this case, trying to argue with my boss about the change of direction in my research, I think my subconscious immediately went back to being that bullied kid again. Thinking about it now, when I was a kid and I was getting some support for being bullied, when people were trying to make me feel better about it, the message I was getting was that it was my fault for being bullied because I didn't stand up for myself enough. It was my fault for being too sensitive, and it was my fault for attracting too much attention. The problem was about me not being tough enough or being able to stand up for myself or whatever. So the support I was getting for bullying was really just kind of blaming me for being bullied. It's interesting to see that that is the exact same message I was saying about myself in this journal entry. In the journal entry, I said, I'll quote it, "I've basically been bullied into it, not through any fault of my boss, but through my own inability to stand up for myself and argue." That's a really interesting connection to make between my childhood bullying and my perception of being bullied as a postdoc. I had assumed that there was a link between the actual bullying I experienced as a kid and re-experiencing that as a postdoc via the emotional trigger of the confrontation. But I was not expecting to see a link between the very bad support I received for being bullied as a kid and the negative thoughts I have about myself in this journal entry. It's almost like the support I received for bullying was actually more damaging to my self-esteem than the actual bullying. That's really interesting. So on reflection, I think my boss was just making a smart decision about the direction of the research, and I wasn't actually being bullied here, but it was just her inner child taking over and writing that journal entry for me. So there you have it. It felt really good to go through that journal entry again. It was very interesting for me to make those connections between my experiences in my childhood, to my PhD, to my postdoc, and to some extent to today. There's something very satisfying about joining those dots together and making those connections. In my own mental health journey, I've learned that some of the steps you can take towards breaking away from the past are to develop self-awareness and to reframe and reinterpret the past with an alternative narrative. I feel like I've done some of that in this episode. In the next episode, we jump to December 2012. As things are winding down for Christmas, I have an end-of-year reflection. As you've probably gathered by now, I'm generally not too pleased with my performance so far in 2012. And I also end up revisiting that question of work-life balance. Until then, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that's been valuable for you in some way. Until the next episode, please be kind to yourself.
Brood about it, brood until the day, one day I will find the words to say.
Thanks again for listening to a Postdocs Journal. I've been your host, Semit Patel. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others who you think might find it helpful and interesting. You could also leave a review over at Podchaser or on Apple Podcasts. If you can relate to anything in this episode, or if you have your own take on this journal entry, I would love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Blue Sky. Links to all my social media are in the show notes. Thanks again.